Well, a couple of things made me decide to start beekeeping. I am a pretty avid gardener, and bees are nice to have to ensure that plants are pollinated. But most importantly, I actually work with a lot of pollinator issues in my job. I wanted to learn firsthand how to more about bees, how they work, how they live, and what it's like to actually be a beekeeper. Becoming a beekeeper is actually pretty easy. I took a class at a local bee store and met every week for 8 or 10 weeks, I believe, and that helped a lot. There's a lot of good books out there, there's a lot of websites, and the process is really pretty easy. The main thing is you set up the hives with foundation, which is the stuff that they build their combs on. And what Emily and I did is we bought a couple of packages of bees, and that's a queen and about 3,000 worker bees and drones, and you basically put them in the box, in the hive box, and leave them alone for a week or so. They all get accustomed to each other, and from there they grow and expand. It's a pretty relatively low cost, low maintenance thing to get into. Bees don't really take much maintenance at all. I'm pretty lazy, so I wouldn't really want anything that takes a lot of maintenance. Typically, you feed in the early spring and then in the late summer. Those are the times of year when there's not much nectar or pollen for them, and so that's every day or two you fill up the feeders, or we do. Otherwise, we'll open the hive and check them every couple of weeks. Occasionally, if you have a colony that's ready to split or something, that can take a little more work. But really, it's one of the lowest maintenance things I think you can have with actual living animals. I mean, and I kind of have the philosophy that bees have been around for millions and millions of years, much longer than we have, and they've kind of figured things out for themselves. So I try to be pretty non-interventionist anyway. Typically, we'll check on the bees every couple of weeks, which entails putting a little smoke on the hives, opening the hive, and we'll pull out some of the frames, which are the rectangular places where the boards that they build their comb on. And you can tell a lot about the health of the bee and the hive by just examining the frames. And then to collect honey, which I had hoped to start by now, but it's just been too cold, we'll put another box on top of the hive, a shorter box called a super, with smaller frames inside it. And then there's a screen that goes below that called a queen excluder that keeps the queen out. And so the worker bees will come up through that screen. The queen is bigger, so she can't fit, but the worker bees will come up there and fill those top frames with honey. And typically here in Raleigh, the only really dependable honey flow we have is right about now in April with the tulip poplars. Believe it or not, these great big trees, and there's a lot of them around here. But they're so tall that you can't hardly see the blooms until they start to fall. But that's a really good source of nectar, and it makes a pretty good honey. It's sort of a dark, pretty intensely flavored honey. So typically you'll leave the super on for a few weeks until that bloom is over, and then take it off. And our plan is to harvest comb honey, so we'll just cut the honeycomb out. But if you were like most people and just going after the honey, you cut off either with a knife, or if you're doing a lot of them, you use a heated tool, and you just slice off the top layer of wax and put those combs in an extractor that spins around real fast, and it just uses centrifugal force to throw the honey out. You run it through a filter, put it in a bottle, you're done. Bees are woodland creatures. In nature, they live, and they're also not native to North America, which is another interesting thing. Apis species that we raise as honeybees is European, primarily an Asian native, and some of the early settlers brought bees here from Europe. Anyway, they live in hollow trees in nature, and this area back here has good shade because our summers are so hot that it's kind of stressful on the bees. They want the inside of the core of their hive is always at 95 degrees, no matter what. If it's 120 outside or if it's 5 below zero outside, they're doing everything they can to keep that 95-degree temperature in there. So in the summer, it will get so hot that some of the bees will leave the hive, and you'll see them sort of just sitting on the front porch. Basically, they're just hanging out all over the outside of the boxes to keep the inside cooler. They'll bring water in and fan it with their wings to create evaporative cooling. They'll do all kinds of things. So putting them in the shade helps with the cooling in the summertime. This is also a little ways away from the street. You know, this is a very urban beehive setup here. We're right in town, and some people are just afraid of bees, and they should be if they're allergic to them. If you're not allergic, I don't think it's a big deal. But some people are just, you know, a little nervous about bees. So we've kind of kept them out of sight of the street, but in a place that's still easy to get to. Well, the bee life cycle and the cycle of a hive is pretty interesting. Bees are social insects, and they live in these colonies that are run by one queen. So there's one queen that's laying the eggs, and a healthy queen in the peak of the season in the spring and summer will lay over 1,000 eggs a day typically. So she's just going along one egg after another, and the colony then, the hive, grows pretty quickly as long as there's food available and there's not disease pressure and all the other things that can affect bees. So every hive at some point, if it's healthy, gets to a point where it has to divide, because the bees know, and they know an incredible amount, for as tiny as they are. The intelligence, that hive mind of bees is really remarkable. So they'll get to a certain point, and they will know that it's time to build a new hive. So they will grow out another queen, and typically the existing queen will leave, and it's called a swarm, and she'll send out a pheromone that pulls some of the workers to her, and they will leave en masse, and you'll see them, and they'll land somewhere, you know, as they're hunting for a place to live, and they're so drawn to that queen that they just form this big, like a ball. And as a beekeeper, you have to be very careful, because you want that to happen, because that's how you get more bees. But at the same time, you have to control that process so that you aren't losing, you know, half of your hive. So if the bees go ahead and swarm, and you can find the swarm, it's a pretty easy thing to simply, if they're hanging on a branch, for example, and I've actually seen people do this, you cut the branch, the bees just sort of fall into a bucket, you have another hive ready, like this empty one I have here, you dump them in there, close the entrance for just a day or two to get them acclimated to it, and you're fine. You've made a new hive. If you are taking a more controlled approach, like a professional beekeeper is, you would be checking those frames for developing queens, and you would be managing that to make what they call a split, which is essentially a controlled swarm, where they take some of the colony, put it in a new hive, and keep it under control that way. It's really an interesting process, and the swarms are one of the things that always sort of frighten people, because it is sort of weird to just see this big ball of bees hanging on a branch or something. But if you ever see one, the thing to do is to find a beekeeper and call them and say, hey, I've got a swarm, do you want it? And they'll of course say yes, because hey, free bees, and typically they'll come and get it, and there's really not much danger, because the bees are so attuned to just hanging with that queen and protecting her that they'll just come along in this big clump. The issues around colony collapse disorder and pollinator loss that is the single biggest thing that got me into beekeeping, because my job for years now has been to work for companies that make insecticides, among many other things. And I work in the agricultural, in the agricultural chemical business. And bees are really important to agriculture. There's certain crops that just don't exist specifically without honeybees, like almonds, oranges, and a few other the very valuable tree fruit and nut crops. So the colony collapse issues that have come up the last several years have been very concerning to the agricultural industry as a whole, and particularly the companies like mine that make part of our money from selling the neonicotinoid insecticides. And I figured, what better way to learn about the actual reality of this than to own bees. So what I've learned over time, there's been a tremendous amount of research on this, and there's a couple of key things. One is it's really complicated. Like most of these issues, there's no black or white. The insecticides are not killing the bees. That's not the cause of colony collapse disorder. In fact, it's not even a major cause. It may be a factor, but it's one of about 10 or 12 more or less sub-factors, I guess you could say. The single biggest issue is the varroa mite, which is a tiny little mite that lives on the honeybee, doesn't directly kill the bees, but makes them weak, weakens their immune system, so any other stress makes them more susceptible, and hence they die. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of this is if you look at Australia, which ironically is where the company I work for is based. They have large bee populations, large agriculture industries, lots of use of the neonicotinoid insecticides that have been implicated as killing bees, and they've had no collapse issues at all, none whatsoever. So what's the difference? Difference is they don't have the mite.